study came out by the Harvard Medical School, which provided some numbers that we didn't have in making this film, which really kind of start to account for some of these hidden costs of coal, both to the nation, but especially they focus in on Appalachia. I think the big figure of the study was that if we were to account for all the costs that are externalized, when we pay for coal from a coal company or a utility, what's not calculated are the health costs and the environmental costs. And if we were to calculate those costs, it would add something like $500 billion to the economy, right?
Right, and I looked over that study briefly today and noticed that the only thing they were talking about in healthcare was diseases as they relate to lung problems. Not all the other problems, cancers or any other thing, developmental problems from mercury emissions or anything else. So, and I also noticed in your film that the gentleman from at the plant at Alloy said, if we could retrofit these old manufacturing plants for efficiency, it was also $500 billion. The same amount of money. So I think, I'm thinking about those two things in my head. Here you have $500 billion you can invest to increase energy efficiency in the Rust Belt, as they said there, capturing energy, actually providing jobs as they retrofit these plants, making the plants cost competitive again, so that we can have manufacturing in this country, or we can continue business as usual down the same failed path and pay $500 billion a year for healthcare costs and externalized costs only, as we know, related to lung problems. This is the astonishing thing to me. So, and that was just in Central Appalachia that they focused on.
Well, yeah, I think there is a part of the study that does look at mercury, and I think the figure was $75 billion a year only in Appalachia in health impacts from air and water pollution. Now, the problem is, it seems to me, is that the incentives are all wrong in terms of encouraging a shift away from coal, because the coal states, and West Virginia is a classic example, is a captured state. Rory, talk a little bit about the extent to which we subsidize the coal industry, particularly here in West Virginia.
Well, the study that we did looked at, there's obviously the direct incentives and then the indirect incentives that have to do with the externalities and everything else. We did a study on the impact of coal on the state budget here in West Virginia and found that not only does the coal industry and the employment associated with the coal industry impose a net cost of over $40 million on the state each year. The state is also subsidizing the industry through tax credits and subsidies of over $100 million. One of the biggest is the over $150 million. I'm sorry. One of the biggest is the thin seam tax credit, and that's a credit that we give to coal companies to mine thin underground coal seams, which whenever you go after the thinner seams, you're having a greater impact on the water, on coal miners' health, on risk to coal miners' lives. And we gave the coal industry $70 million to mine those coal seams in 2008. And a lot of that was actually, I think it's important to point out, a lot of that was actually a giveaway that didn't have to do with mining extra coal, because that tax credit is tied to the price of coal, and these coal companies were selling a lot of this coal overseas for $300 a ton. And so while they were making greater profits, the state gave them an extra $35 million that had nothing to do with creating new jobs or mining more coal. So it's the whole system is kind of, when you think about what an extra $35 million could have done for economic development in the coal fields, for supporting energy efficiency, that's equivalent to what we got from the federal government for the weatherization program for a single year. But we could be financing that every year through that money that we're just giving away.
Part of the impetus of making this film too was it was just at the beginning of the election cycle that Obama election, and we saw these clean coal ads just saturating the airwaves, and no one seemed to know what they were talking about in terms of what is this clean coal. And it sure sounds good, clean coal, okay. But the deeper we looked into it, I mean, Julio Friedman is very pleased with the film, by the way, and we showed it in California recently, and he sat on a panel with me and with Becky Tarbotten from RAN, and he's still convinced that carbon capture and sequestration is the only way to go, because not only the US, but the rest of the world is so dependent on coal. But it keeps coming back to the argument, coal is only cheap because we don't count in all these other externalities. And, the struggle for me is, how are we going to begin to account for those? And I mean, one proposal that has gone nowhere in the US Congress is putting a price on coal. The rest of the world has one on CO2 emissions. I mean, cap and trade was, denigrated as a tax, plan to tax. But how are we, how is our government going to start to shift the policy towards making the incentives proper? What is your feeling, Rory, just in terms of for example, the state of West Virginia, its whole tax structure is so dependent on coal. How can you shift that within this state to improve the incentives?
Well, just to first address the comment that our tax structure is dependent on coal. I don't know if that's exactly what you know, but it's coal.
So many of the revenues are.
Right, well, coal, even looking at the employment, coal in West Virginia only provides approximately, and this is including like the indirect impacts of the industry, a maximum of 15 or 16% of the state's revenues. And that's not, and that's only for one of the two funds. So they actually don't contribute almost anything to the road fund, while they have a significant impact on infrastructure in the state every year. So it's not sort of one of those fallacies that a lot of folks are trying to break down, just because the coal industry has been so successful at building up that propaganda and making everybody believe that we depend on coal. But I think one way is to shift. By shifting resources, you reduce those externalities. And another way to do it, another way to address those externalities and internalize those costs, is to force the polluters to take care of their pollution, whether it be treating streams. That's a cost the coal industry should be having to pay, not the public, because they're reaping the benefits. They should have to pay for the remediation. Same with scrubbers and power plants. And the unfortunate part is they shouldn't be able to push those costs onto the consumer. Exactly. And so I think the best way, obviously, is to incentivize a transition away from coal mining, transitioning the economy, transitioning the tax structure, transitioning the jobs, but also transitioning our energy infrastructure. So.
Interestingly, the family up in Weyburn also, just in the last couple months, did finally get help in funding a study, and they did in fact find elevated levels of CO2, and indicating a possible fracture, or there's a site. The problem with many of these pilot studies for CO2 sequestration is that they happen in oil fields, which are perforated like pincushions with old wells. So you have a problem with the CO2 migrating through corroded old pipes, but this is, as Jeff says, what we're going to be seeing in the future as you speak to liability problems. This stuff CO2 is very, it's an asphyxiant. If it creeps up a fracture into your enclosed basement, you can kill people. Mountaineers and skiers in California occasionally die because there's some naturally occurring CO2 leaks in the mountains, and you go into a valley, you get into one of these places and you die. And in Lake Nyos in Cameroon in the 1980s, a volcanic source of CO2 built up underneath this lake, and one night it turned over basically and killed 150, a large amount of people. I can't remember the exact number, but so this is dangerous stuff. It's highly corrosive, and that's going to be going through pipelines, and we've had many problems with pipelines with natural gas and in the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. So, and then the big thing about this infrastructure is it's, as Václav Smil said, it would require an infrastructure that is at least twice the size of the whole petrochemical industry infrastructure that's evolved over 150 years. And that's only to sequester 10% of the CO2. So, and as the Harvard study just said, it would bring the cost up to about 20 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas we're paying 12 cents now. So coal is beginning to be perceived as not as cheap as it's supposed to be. So makes it, renewable energy much more competitive, and we hope maybe we can see that incentive working.
In comparison, when you was making your film, and I know you was able to come up with high levels of the diseases from the coal. How much of a high level did you come up with wind power, diseases from wind power?
Good question.
Well, Larry's asking about what kind of diseases are caused by wind power, and actually, that's not a happy story altogether. Out in the prairies, where this Kansas wind farmer built his wind farm, it's not a problem because people don't live very close to them. But now that they've started building with the stimulus package, there's been a gold rush to build wind farms up in the Northeast, in the mountains in upper New York State and Maine, and Vermont is seeing this happen now. And the problem is of scale. These wind turbines are bigger than the Statue of Liberty, and they put them up on these small little New England ridges, and you've got people living in the valleys. And the problem with these wind farm turbines is they have a very low level vibration. It goes all day and all night, and it's amplified in the valleys. So, while I think wind turbines in the ridges of Coal River Mountain would be much preferable to blasting them away, wind turbines are not necessarily always the answer in different geographical settings. In these small, highly populated valleys, it's not such a great idea. The idea would be to scale down the turbine size. Because basically you have to remove the top of the ridge to get the tractors, and these turbines are huge. You have to build a 40-foot wide access road, 60 feet wide at the turns, and basically shave the top to make a level cement bed for the turbine. So it's in fact, in the health problems with wind farms, there is a high incidence of hypertension, blood pressure raised, people have insomnia if they're too close. It's just a matter of keeping them about 1.5 miles from a populated area.
I've been looking into the possibilities of geothermal here in West Virginia, which I wanted to hear your comment. It's popular in California, but I think it is a potential here in West Virginia, and I wonder if you'd comment on that, which was not really covered in your film.
Yeah, good point. I don't really feel qualified to comment because I really just don't know. I do know that they have had some problems in I think, is it in California or Washington with seismic problems causing possible exaggeration of seismic faults in Germany as well. But it is indeed promising if it's done correctly. Rory, do you know anything more about geothermal?
For West Virginia, it's, again, I'm not advocating against it, but just to address the issues with it. First of all, it could generate, if we did tap into the resource that they say exists here, we would be able to replace all the existing coal generation, which would have a huge benefit, obviously. The only concerns with the geothermal right now are destabilizing the fault structures, and also you have to drill down between 2 and 3 miles to tap into that resource. And the best resources are in our most protected lands here in West Virginia, so there would obviously be issues related to that as well. So that's far away. But it is a source of baseload power, and you can easily replace coal if we tapped into it. If we did it correctly and made sure to address all the risks, which our legislature doesn't like to do very often, then it would definitely create clean power for a very long time.
During the making of this and showing it around and talking with people, how often have you encountered like showing this in the reactions that people get, have you found that there's been more people that have been surprised that just didn't realize the scale, the scope of what we're doing, and just never thought to care? Or have you even encountered people that don't care because, that just kind of view it and just don't care? Because part of the problem that we face right now, obviously we got companies, some good, some bad, but ultimately, it's kind of a problem that's been driven by us. It's been driven by people and our needs, the power, our iPods and iPhones and everything like that. I guess follow-up question to that is, what's it going to take? Obviously, this documentary is a great step in that direction, but what's it going to take to get people to really start caring about this issue, be more conscious about, even as much as just the light switches in our own home and the light bulbs we use? What's it going to take to get people more conscious about the electricity that we're using, where it's coming from, and trying to spur people into trying to seek other sources?
Well, that's the $50,000 question. How do we get people more exercised about this? And yes, to answer your first question, I often get a response that people just didn't realize the full scope of our dependence on coal, that carbon capture and sequestration was a lot more complicated and full of risks than they had previously realized, if they'd even heard about it at all. But I think it comes back to our pocketbooks, and especially in an economy like we have today, it becomes even, as we can see from the recent actions in Congress, that the bottom line, our pocketbooks, our economy, the price of our electricity, the price of gas at the pump is what gets people, this is what is the primary concern. So the national concern about climate change has gone down in the last 5 years, even as our scientific knowledge has become much more solid. So it's an inverse proportion of the importance and our concern. The last time we got interested in buying hybrid vehicles was in 2008, when the gas prices went way up. And it looks like they're heading that way again because of the Arab crisis. So maybe in a cynical way, you can see there's a silver lining to the unrest there's a lot of silver linings in the unrest in the Arab world, but if it causes gas prices to rise again, maybe it'll spur us into some kind of action. But we have a new Congress in which I think most of the new congressional members took a vow not to believe in climate change. I mean, this is the know-nothings, back to study ignorance on our legislative body. So in that context, how are we going to get any kind of legislation that directs the incentives in the proper direction? It's a tough question. The problem with climate change is you don't see it right in front of your eyes, although we're beginning to see that. Look at there are islands in the Pacific which are now sinking beneath the waves. A filmmaker friend of mine just won the Academy Award for Best Short Documentary for a film called Sun Come Up, about the Carteret Islanders who are now having to go to surrounding islands and beg that they will be taken in because their home island is now underwater, basically. All the wells have flooded and the waters are rising. The Arctic, in the summer months, we now have the Northwest Passage that for how many centuries were we searching for? And there's a race to mine that and to build offshore rigs off the coast of Alaska, when our petroleum reserves will barely provide 2% of the fuel, whereas we consume 25% of it. Human beings don't think long term. Just the way our economy isn't geared to long term. We have a quarterly report structure for corporations. We have a government that's in the hands of industry, thanks to decisions like the recent Supreme Court Citizens United decision, which gives the power of corporations who buy their influence in Congress. And those politicians who are so beholden on this election cycle, on these funds, all the incentives are wrong for us doing the right thing. And we have to shift that somehow.